All right, I've chosen my topic to be what I call invitation decline. This is basically just to have a topic. It's not particularly important, and it may transpire that in the course of talking this afternoon, I believe it's afternoon where you are, I may not even refer back to uh, invitation decline or anything that has anything to do with invitations. I'm certainly grateful to have been invited to this forum. I apologize if my presentation is a little disjointed or distracted. Making presentations long distance is not a form that I'm very familiar or comfortable with, but I'll try my best to be coherent. At the same time, given that I'm at home and it's still very early on a Saturday morning, I'm going to be very informal. Now, the organizers of the forum and I had a very animated conversation earlier, and they know that I'm just as uncomfortable with most of the premises of the forum. For one, and this is probably something that others may have spoken to since yesterday, I'm not quite sure since I haven't followed the whole conference. For one, I do not obviously accept any magicien effect, whatever that means. I don't believe in magic, and as one of the previous speakers mentioned, quoting an African artist, the very language and metaphor of magic is not one that I particularly enjoy or relate to. If I may put it bluntly, only the French and Germans would have referred to magic when thinking of the rest of the world. It's as though when we step out of Europe to acknowledge the larger world, we step out of rationality into magic. Europe is reason, and the world, that is to say the rest, is magic. So I never regarded Manier and his magic with any more than dismissive boredom, quite frankly, and therefore do not recognize any landmark moment around his show or ideas. I should mention also that much theoretical debate at the moment is something that I cannot exactly relate to as an artist or even as a theorist. Not only am I skeptical about theory at the moment, my skepticism is so deep, it borders on cynicism. I think that a great deal of prevailing theory has very little to do with art, or in fact, with intelligent thought, rather than competitive posturing. For this reason, much current theory is really very narrowly selective of what it engages and what it very deliberately avoids or ignores. In effect, theory is hardly reflective of the facts of visual practice in the real world. It seems to be a world entirely unto itself, and one that most artists have very little interest in at the moment. So I won't be making any theoretical elaborations. I'll simply throw out a couple of bullet points, if you like, for conversation around a few issues of common interest. And I won't be taking as much time as I probably am expected to. I think that if questions arise around some of the ideas that I mentioned, then it's a lot easier to deal with them in conversation. Briefly, I'd like to return to the idea of global art. In my thinking, global art is really no more than a label created by curators and scholars that has rather very little relevance to artists or to contemporary visual practice. No artist that I know goes out of his or her way to say, I make global art. In essence, global art is what our theorist friends like to call an empty signifier. You bring to it whatever you may. Now, it's true to say that there are global trends in current visual art practice, and I think that's thanks to increased itinerancy and also to the fact of a more assertive non-Western element of presence in the West today. And this fact has meant that a far more diverse demographic is involved in the exercise, I think, of institutional power. Now, institutional power is something that we like to be, how would one put it, skeptical about. I think skepticism is the right word. But it's also a fact of life, and one that has relevance in all of our practices. And now this non-Western presence and institutional power it may not be as conspicuous as it probably could be, but I think that it's certainly substantial. And contrary to conjecture, it has made and continues to make a significant difference in the lives and careers of numerous artists in every part of the world. And again, I think this is really important. This is something that I kind of touched on in my earlier conversation with the organizers, which is to say that whatever we talk about, global, local, universal theory, and all of that, we also have to recognize that art practice has to do with lives, real lives of real people. People who practice art as a profession, who live by making art, who go out of their way to try to, in some cases, change the world by making art, but more essentially, in the most part, I think, to simply put food on the table for their families. It's not theory, it's real. And whatever makes a difference in the lives and careers of real artists making real work as professionals, trying to survive in whatever part of the world, in my thinking, is very important and significant. I think that this presence and institutional power in the West of non-Western contributors has also given many artists access that they didn't have in the past to a larger viewership than ever before. Now, bear in mind that less than 100 years ago, perhaps even just 50 years ago, much of the art that came out of Africa was anonymous, that they were simply objects. Nobody knew who made them, or nobody cared to know who made them. That's something that has changed. Now there is a certain element of acknowledgement of authorship. No matter how skeptical we are about authorship and its institutional connections, it's something that is important to many artists, not just in the West. It's not a Western notion. Authorship is something that is important to artists everywhere in the world. And part of the difference that this fact of presence in institutional power has made is to bring acknowledgement of authorship to other parts of the world. I think that's significant. There's no question whatsoever that increased diversity in institutional presence and power in the art world has given minority artists, not just in the West, but outside also, greater visibility and more secure access. And this applies to artists in all kinds of practice, be they artists who work within the dominant market, those who make what some derisively like to call couch paintings, or those who work outside the traditional market, who engage in what we now popularly like to refer to as social practice. it's interesting that we should somehow try to dismiss or minimize the significance of this. But I did think a little earlier when one of the previous speakers quoted Okwuenwezor. Just think about it. 25 years ago, people from certain parts of the world were not even part of the global registry of thought. I'm not talking about art now, but thought. People from certain parts of the world were not even considered as being part of the global registry of philosophy or ideas. And without the forceful intervention of the Edward Saids and Rashida Rains and Okwuenwezors on the global stage, and the fact of their inevitable belonging on the stage, in most instances, as part of institutional power, no matter how critical they are of that power, who would think to quote Said or Enwezor as consequential leaders of thought? In essence, as far as I see it, global art as defined by the Hans Beltings and Peter Weibels and others may already be redundant and in need of succession or transcendence. But global art or global cultural practice, as defined by those who once had little say, I think is far from redundant. Global cultural practice, as most artists understand it, especially artists who've only just gained access to acknowledgement, not just in or by the West, but by their contemporaries in other parts of the world, is far from over or dead or in need of retirement. So it really all depends on who is speaking and who is supplying or generating the levels and who is defining them and how real these levels are in people's lives. I'll take that up, qualify that as a writer. And the rest of what I have to say is simply just throwing out a couple of more ideas. One is about radical practice, and I go straight to radical practice and out of global art because radical art practice is, in my thinking, probably one area of common interest between myself and the organizers of the forum. And although the audience is obviously was not privy to our conversation, I think that we had a few sore points in that conversation around the nature and state of radical art practice at the moment. And I'd like to illustrate what I think is the state of art practice, global radical art practice at the moment, by making reference to a certain incident that happened not so long ago involving a major international artist whom I think we might describe as a practitioner of social art. This individual who works out of New York has made work in different parts of the world, including Rwanda and other places, and is well recognized for such interventions. We happen to know each other fairly well, and not so long ago, he was a guest at my university, at the University of Connecticut. And as acquaintances, we've exhibited together in different parts of the world and done projects together. It was natural that I should meet up with him. So I went out to lunch with him and the rest of our graduate students. And we had a very brief conversation. He was very keen on finding out what I'm doing at the moment. And I mentioned to him that my latest work at the time, this was about 5 years ago, was a stone wall, natural stone wall, which I'd put in a gallery. And it was very interesting to see the look on his face. He looked very stunned, a little confused. So I went on to explain that, in fact, my concern or my interest with the work was very formal. It was all about line as an element. And at that point, he looked at me again and he said, so is that the kind of work you're making now? And I thought that was very interesting because it's also quite familiar with my other work that might be described as social work. But I felt that what that conversation spoke to is the very narrow manner in which we try to define radical practice at the moment. A while ago, not so long ago, radical practice was a much broader spectrum that was not just about social practice, but also formal. But it does seem to me that today we think only in terms of social practice when we talk about radical practice. And I think there's also a feeling that there are artists who do social practice or radical art, and then there are artists who don't. And there's no space where we locate artists who do both. And the fact of the matter is that there's so many artists practicing in the world today who do both. I think, for instance, of the recent sad, tragic incident in Mexico, where a number of teaching college students went missing. And some of the first people who demonstrated and made interventions were artists. And these weren't artists who we would normally refer to as artists who do social practice. These were regular artists who have painting studios and have galleries. Some of them are parts of institutions, perhaps. And some of them are part of the market. But on this occasion, they found it necessary to make a social intervention. And that is just very common. So the tendency, I think, for some to believe that there has to be a firm demarcation between those artists who engage in social practice and those who are part of the market and therefore complicit in the system. I think that's a false dichotomy because there's nothing preventing artists who are part of the market as professionals also making social interventions when the need arises. And quite often, they in fact do. I also think, going by my experience with certain artists that I know in different parts of the world, in Africa and other places, that there are other ways in which artists make social interventions that have very little to do with making art as a social tool. I know artists who, because they're able to make art, and because they're part of the institution, if you like, or the market, and because they're able to market their work, put their work in museums or in private collections or wherever they put those works, or even auctions, and they're able to generate income, they're therefore able to go back to their communities and make practical interventions, whether it's in helping to build community centers or establish programs or establish scholarships for young people or students who do not have the means. So in essence, they're not making art that is social art, but they're using their practice to generate the means to return to their communities and make practical interventions. That, in my thinking, is still a form of social practice. So I would, as part of these bullet points and as part of some of the side conversations that you might have at the conference outside of pure theory, I would suggest that you also consider this dimension to the nature and state of social practice in the world today. And it's not new. I would point that out. I think this is important. I always like to remind people that Picasso was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. But his paintings weren't necessarily communist paintings. And still he was able to make interventions. He made posters, he engaged in demonstrations, he helped artists, he mentored artists, he made peace interventions and promoted social ideas, and made it I think made it easier for certain people to identify with the Soviet Union at the time, for good or ill, just by being a member of this movement, without necessarily making paintings that were about social issues. So there's a broad spectrum to radical practice that may not be simply within a performance stage or a studio or an intervention online, and so on and so forth. The other thing I would point out is that in my thinking, there seems to be a trend, a related trend, I think, for mostly younger artists, emerging artists, to then buy into this narrow definition of social or radical art practice, and therefore begin to question their place as artists in the world, and develop what I've called a messianic mentality, that artists are out there to save the world. And if you're not such an artist, if you're not out there trying to save the world with your art, then you are part of the problem, because you're part of the system. I think this is an unnecessary delusion on the part of many artisans. In very significant ways, this delusion is driven by theory that has very little understanding of what actually happens in an artist's life. Theoreticians who have no understanding and no experience of what an artist goes through, how an artist tries to generate the means to produce their work. And I think that, again, in your continuing conversations within this forum and afterwards, people must begin to redefine our understanding of radical practice at this point in time. Never mind whether it's a global century or not a global century. I think those are just catchphrases. What's important is to broaden our understanding of these practices, and not have the delusion that artists are particularly special and not like anyone else, not like lawyers or bankers or engineers. In conclusion, because I think I've taken probably more time than I promised to, I guess it's necessary to understand that practice is essentially pragmatic. All radical practice is by nature and essence pragmatic. We cannot dictate for artists what radical practice is and what radical practice is not, and who is complicit with the system and who is part of the problem, and who is making a difference in the world, because all artists, one way or another, are making some difference in somebody's life, except in the very rare instance, and I'm not aware of any of that, where an artist goes out of their way to create work that supports or promotes retrograde ideas. Otherwise, all artists in their limited ways, and it's always limited, are making a difference in somebody's life. And I think I'll just stop there. And I don't know if this has anything to do with finding alternative languages for global practice or for the future. But these are just ideas that came to me as I was in conversation with the organizers of the forum and afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, Olu. It's Pedro. I don't know. You probably.
Hi, Pedro.
How are you? So I'm actually glad you. Sometimes when you were not participating yesterday, so you couldn't know. I think you were assuming that we were discussing social practice because so many people in these kinds of forums actually care about it, but we actually had not spoken about it at all. So I'm glad you introduced it, and one of the reasons why I am personally glad you did is because in some publications and other places like these, I often like to bring up the fact that it is not by coincidence that there are these interesting correlations in history when we do look at a global picture. So for example, the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States was very well funded. Nixon started it. It wasn't a leftist government that started it. It was Nixon. And it was very well funded until the 80s. And then it started getting defunded. And it's very confusing. But if you see it in relation to the Cold War, you understand it perfectly well. It was set up as the competition, as this notion of the individual supported genius artist will be the Western model of the global artist, and the Russian totalitarian, dogmatic, everybody do socialist realist. But with social practice, there's, to me, this coincidence too. In the last 2 decades, we've seen this obsession in Western art historical writing, both US and Europe, of periodizing social practice, what we call social practice as social healing, of saying where it started, who did it first, all of these. And to me, it's not by chance that actually in the rest of the world, these very practices that we now call social practice have been the main form of cultural production for centuries, So there's a lot at stake in accepting this periodization, in saying it started when such and such artist did something in such and such museum, And so part of why I think it's a really important conversation for this idea of geographies of art and geoaesthetic is I don't think we should accept this periodization. Even if we must, first of all, periodization itself, we may question. But we should think of these larger lineages of artists, for example, which practices, Haiti came up earlier, right? Which practices of dance, of ritual, are connected to radical art practice, And so, I know you care about these things too, but basically, I wanted to make sure that this relation to social practice was something we have not discussed at all. It did not bring up.
Well, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. But you're right. If I may intervene, you're very right, and I think the point of, if you like, forced periodizations and lineages is one that Salah Hassan and I had addressed in the exhibition that we curated for the Venice Biennial in 2001, I think it was, where we spoke about performance art, for instance, and the fact that what we now call performance art is only a slightly different or emerging form of something that's existed for long in different cultures. And it's very interesting because now there seems to be if you like, a renaissance of that kind of practice in non-Western locations. In Africa, for instance, in Lagos, for instance, lots of emerging artists are taken to performance art after having rejected it for decades. And the irony, of course, is that the form of performance that they're producing has more to do with those rituals that were already there before performance art became performance art. So even, I think this is relevant perhaps to the idea of global art being a failure and the need for alternative languages or alternative forms of conversation. When you look at the fact that performance art is re-emerging in those locations, one tendency is to think of it in terms of post-colonial mimicry, that this is an indication, if you like, of Western forms translating to other areas. If you like, universalizing art, which is what we all want to avoid, we all want to run away from. But that's really not the fact. This is not performance art per se universalizing itself. And I would hesitate to think of those emerging practices and those other locations as mere post-colonial mimicry, because they're actually very unique to those locations. Performance art in Lagos at the moment has very little to do with performance art in other parts of the world. And while that may seem predictable, what's interesting is that it has more to do with Yoruba rituals prior to modern art, prior to contemporary art, prior to the invention of what we now call performance art. So global art, is it time to move on for global art? And then you have these emerging forms that still locate themselves or would like to locate themselves within global practice, because global practice has always been there. All we did in the 90s is to say, oh, by the way, now we can acknowledge that these practices have been there. But like you said, they've always been there.
Yes, a comment. Olu, can you hear me?
Sure.
I just want to thank you for bringing to the debate this important issue of the complexity of theoretical thinking and even some certain kind of academia production in the way they construct the world and the way they inform the way we think about artistic practices. Not only artistic practices, but academia and theory in producing the world as you say, Europe as the natural place of reason and the rest of the world as the natural place of senses, telluric identities, etc. Theory had a large history of a dark history in the production of those ideas, and I think it's something to be seriously considered, how theoretical thinking is involved in geographically and geoepistemologically producing the rest of the world, and this is something that the artistic practice must be implicated with in the whatever you can say, social practices, political practices, whatever is part of the discussion, is part of the practice. And I agree with you that the form or thinking in the practice, the form of art, whatever is that, must imply a thinking on the place and the conditions from which this social practice came from. So I think that I'm not sure that you are thinking in this combination between form and practice. And for example, with probably Ricardo Basbaum, the Brazilian artist, that is making this social sculpture as a social practice, but at the same time is really embedded in a basic abstract form that is put it there to be thought as a problem. And I think that could be a combination of these two dimensions that you explicitly criticize as working as a result of some kind of theoretical predisposition. So thank you for bringing this discussion.
Thank you.
Oui, j'aurais voulu intervenir simplement sur un point de détail, sur l'utilisation du thème radical. Je suis assez critique toujours sur l'utilisation du thème radical en art, comme en politique d'ailleurs. Je ne pense pas que l'art est forcément en tant que tel être radical. Ça marche pardon. Moi personnellement, l'usage que je fais du terme radical, ce qui pour moi, l'usage intéressant que j'ai trouvé historiquement du terme radical, celui que faisait l'architecture radicale italienne dans les années 60, qui était le fait, non pas de faire la critique, c'était tout cette remise en question de l'architecture moderniste à l'époque, et au lendemain de la guerre, et pour l'architecture radicale italienne, il s'agissait non pas tellement de critiquer négativement l'architecture moderniste, mais de pousser au maximum, de procéder à une surenchère, à une suraffirmation, mais non pas du tout négativité, mais au contraire une suraffirmation de l'architecture moderniste pour montrer l'absurdité, et pour montrer que l'architecture moderniste conduisait à quelque chose d'inhabitable. Et donc ça, c'est c'est très proche des idées de Baudrillard sur la surenchère. C'est le fait non pas du tout d'avoir une voix négative, mais une voix au contraire de la suraffirmation qui permettent effectivement aussi de montrer ce à quoi conduit une certaine forme artistique, là en l'occurrence c'est l'architecture moderniste. Donc ça c'est l'usage que je trouve intéressant. Moi toujours quand j'utilise radical, c'est toujours dans ce sens de quelque chose qui pousse à la limite, au lieu de se borner à critiquer comme ça, qui pousse à la limite, et qui en montre finalement l'inadéquation.
Precisely, I totally agree with you, and that's why I recall the story of the artist who was a guest at my university and the conversation that we had. Because my definition of radicalism is exactly the same as yours. It's something that pushes the boundaries. But his understanding of radicalism is limited to social interventions that are critical. And I guess part of my point was that we have to broaden our understanding of radical practice to re-acknowledge, not really simply acknowledge, but to remember that radical practice also includes that notion of pushing the boundaries, whether it's formalistic or social or whatever it is, and moving things beyond where they are, and testing the limits. That is also a radical practice. The reason I brought it up, and it's important that you help define it, is that there is a trend. And this may be limited to the United States. I don't know if it's the same in Europe, but it may well be too. But there is a trend among emerging artists, and theory is complicit in this, as I said, to understand radicalism and radical practice only in those terms of social criticism. And that's why it's essential for us to reassert that formal interventions that push the limits, that redefine how things are done, those are also radical. And in fact, they do contain within them possibilities that have social implications as well, that we may not preempt or understand until they begin to unfurl or to reveal themselves. So I totally agree with you.